Start with welcoming everyone once again for our second Afro Latinidad series with LatinoLEAD. We have an amazing program for you with amazing and wonderful experts of the work on Afro Latinidad. And so we are going to get started to allow for our panelists to share their expertise and also allow a lot of time for Q&A. My name is Irma Marquez Trapero. I'm the executive director of LatinoLEAD. And if you are new to our organization, welcome. We hope to see you again. A little bit about our nonprofit. Really, our focus is to ensure that Latinos in Minnesota have the powers and tools to excel in our influence, success, and power. And we do a lot of different virtual events, but we also are working on the leadership development program for Latinx in the state. And you can learn more about us in our website as well. But I want to right now turn it over to our wonderful panelist and our moderator, Faustina. And they will have an opportunity to introduce themselves and then run a little bit about how the show is going to go. So thank you so much for being part of this event. Faustina, thank you so much for taking it over.
Oh, I can't hear her.
Thank you. I was muted.
Okay.
Buenos dias, everyone. Thank you, Irma. I'm really excited to be here. As Irma said, my name is Faustina Jarolin Cuevas. I use she, her pronouns. And we have a great lineup for you here today to talk about Afro Latinidad. So I'm excited, and you know, it doesn't matter where you are in the conversation. If you're somebody that is just becoming new to the idea of Afro Latinidad, if you yourself identify as Afro Latinx, or if you're somebody that really studies it and wants to understand more and wants to really benefit from the conversation, welcome. We welcome all of you, and we're excited for you to be here today. Just a little bit about myself. I'm currently a diversity, equity, and inclusion independent consultant. And I have worked in higher education specifically for around 10 years. And I have a lot of experience talking about DEI work and doing social justice work. I consider myself a change agent, as somebody, a social activist, a community activist. And I currently live in Lynn, Massachusetts. And that's where I'm originally from. I was telling everyone before we let everyone in that I was born in Salem. I'm a little bit of a bruja. I like to consider myself that. So, and what brings me to this conversation today, I do identify as Afro-Latina. My parents are Dominican immigrants from the Caribbean. My dad is a Black man, and I strongly relate to my racial identity as Black. And so this is like a personal narrative for me. It's a personal story. This is something that I'm extremely passionate about, that I've talked to other folks about, that I'm still exploring, right? Our identities are always evolving, and there's always more to learn. So excited to be here, and I want to pass it on to Dr. Gerardo Licon to tell us a little bit about himself.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Gerardo Licon. I am an assistant professor of Latin American and Latinx studies at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. And let's see, I identify as Chicano in the 1960s sense of someone who's proud of their indigenous background and who works toward the betterment of my community. I certainly do not have the lived experience as an Afro-Latino or Afro-Caribeño or descendant of, although as you'll hear me talk later, I do argue that more of Latin America and Latinos in the United States have more of a Black descendancy than we realize and than we tell each other. So we'll get more into that later. So Chicano, Mexican-American immigrant parents from Jalisco, Mexico, born and raised in Los Angeles, and I've been living in Wisconsin for 10 years.
Thank you so much. And now we have Dr. Jennifer Carolina Gomez Menjivar.
Thank you, Faustina, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Very excited about this conversation. I think it's an important conversation to have. Historically, we are at the best point to really discuss the trajectories of Blackness in Latin America and in Latinx experience. I am originally from El Salvador. I come from a line of Maya coffee pickers that crossed the border from Guatemala to El Salvador, and then before arriving here in the US. And I'm also Afro-descendiente, Afro-Indigenous on my mom's side, though I do not present and have not had an Afro-Latinx experience, so to speak, here in the US, and we can get into that a little later. For me, what brings me to this conversation and what brings my work to where it is, it's the experience of being in a Black and Brown community in South Central LA. That's where I grew up. And then beginning my graduate work in Latin American studies and realizing that while there was plenty of research and plenty of primary texts that told us about the Black experience during the colonial period, after independence, poof, it seemed that both in primary texts and in secondary texts, that Black experience was completely omitted. So that question of why, how, when was really what drove me to really begin this research into Afro-Latin American experience, Afro-indigeneity, and what that means across the different regional divides and linguistic divides that we see in Latin America, which is really comprised of 24 countries, a ginormous region.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Excited to dive in here. And I do want to name that we are lighter Latinos speaking on this experience. And, you know, there are our darker brothers and sisters that do have these lived experiences. And there's something to be said there about the weight of what, you know, some of our colleagues or friends or family members carry that we don't necessarily have to think about. So there's definitely some privilege there that we're coming in with today. And hopefully we're just able to have a conversation on talking about how these things manifest so that we can be more supportive, we can be better allies to Afro-Latinx community members, and just really be supportive and more understanding and have some language, you know, in order to move forward. So excited to be here, and we're gonna just go ahead and keep moving forward because, you know, time just comes and goes. So just to get us on the same page here, we have some terminology that we want to share. Some of you may recognize some of this terminology, for some of you it may be new. Either way, we thought it was important to just kind of have some grounding to get us started here. So race, the term race refers to the concept of dividing people into populations or groups on the basis of various sets of physical characteristics, which usually result from genetic ancestry. Ethnicity is defined as a population group whose members identify with each other on the basis of common nationality or shared cultural traditions. There's been a lot of confusion over time in the US, right? Especially around the term Hispanic and us believing that Hispanic was a race for a long time. And there was a lot of confusion. Even me growing up, going to school, you know, when filling out the census, I'm like, I don't see myself here. And over time, right, I understood some differences in what it means to live in this body and understand the African diaspora and right, that education that comes with that. With that said, Latinidad is an ethnicity, not a race. And Afro-Latinidad is a combination of race and ethnicity, right? It's acknowledging that Afro part is acknowledging our African ancestry, and it's embracing that. And those two things together is what we're going to be talking about today. Colorism is defined as prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the ethnic or racial group. This impacts every part of the world. You can be surprised, you're talking to someone from the Asian diaspora and how, you know, colorism shows up there, other parts of Africa and other places all over the world. I've had conversations with all walks of life and how this manifests itself in, you know, all over the globe. And then some symptoms, what I like to call symptoms of colorism, pigmentocracy and anti-Blackness. And I actually believe Dr. Gomez Menjivar is going to be hitting on pigmentocracy a little later, so I won't dive too much into that. Anti-Blackness, we've seen it in our communities a lot, and we're going to be able to, we're going to ask some questions today and really unpack on like how we can be better allies, how we cannot perpetuate anti-Blackness within our communities and within our families and other parts of the communities that we may be involved in. So who are Afro-Latinos, Latinas, Latinx people? Afro-Latinos are defined as people of African descent in Mexico, Central and South America, and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And by extension, those of African descent in the United States whose origin are in the Latin America or in the Caribbean. This is Dr. Haywood. Dr. Haywood has actually done a lot of research on Afro-Latinx communities, and we found it fascinating. Actually, my colleague Carolina is on the call too today, and her and I did a presentation on Afro-Latinidad, and it was really hard to find research on Afro-Latinidad. And Dr. Haywood is one of the scholars that has done probably the most, I would say, research on this community. So it's actually, again, there's a lot to learn, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I'm glad that folks are tuning in and are invested in learning more. The term Afro-Latino indicates that Blackness as a racial identity, again, right, that's the racial part, can apply to a variety of ethnicities, and Latinidad as an ethnicity can compromise individuals of any assortment of races. Going back to, again, the African diaspora is across race as well. And you see that within different communities across the globe. And I wanted to acknowledge a lot of folks have asked, like, why do we say Afro-Latinx? Where's the X coming from, right? You hear Latinx, you hear Afro-Latinx. And that's really to respect and honor our community members who don't identify within the gender binary, right? So who don't necessarily fit or identify within the male or female category. And we want to be more accepting of our community members that are beyond the binary, and understand that Latino and Latina are, in our language, are very gendered. So this is a way to honor and respect other members of the LGBTQ community, and be allies, be in solidarity with other community members. So I hope I haven't lost you, but just want to get us grounded here on some terminology and making sure that we're here on the same page. So slavery in the Americas, I'm going to jump in here with some history and context to get us started. Right, slavery, for folks that may know this, slavery just did not happen in the United States, right? It happened in all of the Americas, and you know, once I was doing this research, I was really, personally, I was shocked to find out that 12 million African slaves that were brought to the New World, the vast majority, 91% to be specific, were taken to what is today known as Latin America and the Caribbean. So that information, to me, being a US citizen, being born of Dominican immigrant parents, that number was astounding to me, right? Because I think the way we're taught in school, the things that we're learning, these things are not necessarily named, and it's not something that you have conversations about. So that number was really shocking to me when I first started learning about my own identity and understanding my own identity development. So just some information there for folks to know. And then 1/4 of all US Latinos self-identify as Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, or African descent with roots in Latin America. Again, really astounding numbers and shocking for me personally. And this is a map of the transatlantic slave trade, which started in the late 1400s and continued into the 1500s. And it's fascinating, again, just based on the numbers I just shared about the 12 million going to Latin America and the Caribbean. We can see this map, and this actually is a virtual map that I will share with Irma to share out with everyone that joined us today. This is a virtual map that will show you over time how slaves were imported to these different continents. And again, you will be shocked to see where the numbers are. But again, given all of this, given what we know, and given how, slaves were brought to the Americas, it's really, really shocking still that we still have racial stigmatization and downplaying of our African heritage, kind of like what Dr. Licon was saying in the beginning, right? That there's a lot of like almost denial of our African ancestry, or like this this misunderstanding of what that means. Because again, a lot of folks still think Hispanic is a race, and there's a little of unlearning that we all have to do because of the lack of education or understanding around these topics in the US and in our educational systems when we're not necessarily learning about our own history. So there's something to be said about that. And now I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Licon, who's going to take us into another journey here on some other history that's really important to know.
Again, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're at. You know, usually these communities, Latinx and Black, are discussed as distinct communities. But part of what we're getting at today is that, you know, there's Afro Latinx who are both. And even the two separate communities have a lot more overlap than we're regularly taught. And so that's part of what I want to get at. Another part of that is also I think, and I'm sure Faustina can elaborate later more on this, you know, how there's, I think there's a strong East Coast, West Coast difference in understanding on the topic. Where in the East Coast, there's more Afro-Caribeños. And for people in the West Coast, and then to varying degrees in the middle of the country, you know, more of a realization that there are people who are both Latinx and Black. And we'll get more into that. Let's see. So I'll go a little bit more into the history of it. And beginning with, you know, sort of the origins of this unique mixture of people has to do with slavery, which Faustina addressed, and then during colonial period, which was, sometimes you forget how long the colonial period was, 300 years, and the casta system that developed. Now, in the United States, we have more of a history, a legacy till this day of the one drop rule. And in Latin America, it was a little different. In Latin America, there were gradations. There were this hierarchy, which I believe Dr. Gomez Menjivar will talk about as well. And so, you know, in the United States, you have any Black in you, you're Black. In Latin America, these gradations meant that people would do their best to pass for a gradation higher on the racial hierarchy. And hence, you know, we get to terms like morenos, popular in Mexico and Dominican Republic, and other places just kind of completely denying their Black ancestry. And so yeah, this is a casta system. It was very complex. Here's the famous casta paintings with 16 different kinds of castas, or what we would think of as races, depending on who was mixed with what. And so I'll focus a little bit more on Mexico and Mexicans in the United States and Black and brown communities in both places. And so a lot of people, for example, are unaware that sort of the Black history in Mexico. And so, like I mentioned, for 300 years, there was a racial hierarchy. They had slaves too. You know, the indigenous people were toward the bottom, and African descendants were even below. But Mexico has a very interesting and prominent Black history. This image is of Gaspar Yanga, who was a former slave who freed himself, freed others, and created the first free Black community town in the Americas. Was started in Mexico, and he ended up fighting the Spanish for 30 years before they came to a truce and his town was recognized. And so there's a YouTube video that I provide the link for that you're welcome to watch, where you can learn a little bit more. And so again, it's 300 years of teaching Latin America that it was a bad thing to be indigenous or Black. And so once these countries become independent, that just doesn't instantly erase. They continue with these legacies. In fact, those 300 years are longer than these countries have been independent countries. They haven't been independent countries for 300 years yet. And so it's a strong historical legacy. And so they would, so yeah, there's this history of hiding their blackness culturally, demographically, historically, in lots of different ways. Oh, sorry. Okay, so for example, there was Mexico's second president was Black. He was an independence leader, and he ended slavery in 1829 without the need of a civil war. There's a history of, Texas broke away from the United States, or not, and to a large extent because they wanted to continue slavery. There's a history of slaves fleeing not only to Canada or the northern United States through the Underground Railroad, but also to Mexico. And there's also a strong history of Mexicans being lynched in some places and sometimes at higher rates than even African Americans. And so in the Southwest, there was discrimination and segregation and this lynching that I mentioned, along with African Americans. In the 20th century, there's also a lot of, there were the 1943 Zoot Suit riots, which I'm writing a book about, where Mexican Americans would use a style of clothing, the Zoot Suit, which was first popularized by African Americans, and they paid the price through getting beat up in riots for it. During the Civil Rights Movement, they had similar experiences in terms of the Civil Rights Movement with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez. And there's, they weren't isolated, they were in communication with each other, which is what this demonstrates. And then when it evolved into the power movements, the Black Power, Brown Power movements, they evolved in those ways too, with the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets for Mexican Americans, and the Young Lords for Puerto Ricans. And more recent, and very much hits home with the Twin Cities today. In the LA riots in 1992, a lot of times we forget the degree to which Latinos or Koreans were also part of that mix and what was going on. And Latinos actually made up the majority of the people arrested during the rioting. And we have a very long history of overlapping in culture, from the Zoot Suits I mentioned to the creation and listening to all these different types of music. And then we get to today, where finally in Mexico, this year is the first year that they're recognizing their the people of African descent in the Mexican census. And we have the simultaneous racism that happens today from COVID-19, which reminds us that racism isn't about people being racist. It's about things that are being systemic and institutionalized, so that things like COVID-19 would affect people, different groups differently, to the colorism that still persists to this day. I have this image of, why are novelas so white? And the criminal justice system. And so that's also a reminder that it's not just about police, it's the courts, and it's the criminal justice system in terms of prisons as well. Well, I'll stop there, and I'll welcome questions later on.
Thank you so much. Yes, we encourage questions also in the chat. So that way we can have Irma and Ginny track those for some conversations and some Q&A time. Thank you so much, Dr. Licon. I'm gonna hand it off here to Dr. Gomez Mejibar.
think we're still viewing the screen. If we could just go back to maybe even the title slide, or whatever you wish.
Yeah, you can. I'll figure it out. You can just.
All right, sounds good. Okay, thank you everyone again for joining us. One of the hooks or entry points to this talk that I'd like to share with you today is the idea that the trajectory of Afro-Latin Americanness or Afro-Latinidad really depends on geography, and that it's a segmented experience that doesn't really fit in one box, just like Latinidad doesn't fit in a box. And we can start with the period of independence to really launch us into this discussion. We know, for instance, that Brazil gained its independence in 1822, but yet was the last country to abolish slavery. It didn't occur until 1888. Haiti was a country that liberated itself and was liberated by slaves, and yet was shunned for it. And then we have other countries that perhaps we're more familiar with that we'll get into in this discussion. But my goal here is really to examine the historical context of Afro-Latinidad by examining what happened to Black peoples, Afro-descendants, and individuals that identified as Black or Moreno, or in many of the other casta categories that were developed during the colonial period, what happened during and immediately after independence. So we can segment the entire region. And when we talk about the region of Latin America, I want us to go back to the period and imagine the Latin American geography as one that reached as far north as California. California, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, these were all places that were included in what was once the Viceroyalty of New Spain and then became independent Mexico in 1821, for instance. In 1821, the conversation about emancipation really starts to gain steam, which means then that there were individuals that were Afro-descendant or identified as Negro or identified in any of the former castes as Black that became free and that were highly urbanized. Remember that Mexico did not have the kind of plantation system that Cuba had, for instance, that Brazil had, for instance, but rather had a large Afro-descendant population that was really clustered in urban areas. That was the case as well in Central America. So we have a great number of individuals that gained their freedom in 1821. Now, when Texas becomes its own nation, because it was its own nation for a good 3 years before it decided to join the United States, joining meant that those individuals were then subject to the one-drop rule, as Dr. Licon mentioned earlier, and also meant that enslavement was a possibility. In fact, there were individual slave owners that moved from areas like Louisiana, taking advantage of the land grants that were opened up when Texas became an independent nation, and brought their slaves with them. So when we talk about Afro-Latinidad, let's not miss the opportunity as well to talk about what happened in 1848 and before the Civil Rights Movement, before emancipation in the United States, and recognize that there was a population that was absorbed into the United States that lived freely for decades before being re-enslaved and re-racialized. So that's an interesting population, interesting area to think about when we discuss Afro-Latinidad. Aside from that, moving into Mexico and moving into Central America, some of you might be familiar with the history there and might know that Central America and Mexico became independent at the same time in 1821. In 1823 is when we start looking at bills, essentially legal forms of incorporating formerly enslaved people into the citizenry. And so we have the passing of very liberal-minded, very these procedures that really wanted to emphasize the color blindness of this new republic, of this new collection of republics. Now, what that meant is that census that would be taken across this territory in Mexico and in what was then the 5 United Provinces of Central America would eliminate any reference to racial categories. The only indicator there would be a mestizo category that absorbed everyone into one citizenry and designated others as those indigenous others. So there were indigenous others, and then there was a full citizenry. That full citizenry included those Afro descendants, included those Black peoples. In fact, as Dr. Licon mentioned, many of the first generals, presidents, leaders, political leaders in these countries were Afro descendant. Juliet Hooker, who is an Afro-Nicaraguan political theorist, has a chapter in Blacks and Blackness in Central America that is listed on the resources, where she actually discusses the unwillingness of US officials to meet with the new leaders of the Central American governments, specifically Nicaragua, because they were Afro-descendant. And so they actually espoused the same racist assumptions when they dealt with these new leaders who were presented and were identified as Afro-descendant, but had this significant position in the new countries. Now, the conversation around emancipation became a lot more complex in the Southern Cone, specifically in what was once the Viceroyalty of Peru and places like Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. In Argentina, in Chile, in these places, we see a more gradual transition to emancipation that included first, kind of as a stepping stone, the passing of laws, free womb laws, so to speak. These free womb laws meant that enslaved women who had children then this enslavement would not proceed into that next generation. That was one of the clauses negotiated after independence in those early 1820s in these countries. Now, that didn't end enslavement for the mothers, but it did end enslavement for future generations. Now, the emancipation would not happen until much later, 1860s, 1880s, depending on the country that we're discussing in that Southern Cone. So very complex, segmented process there. In both the Andes and the Southern Cone, as well as in the former Viceroyalty of New Spain, or what we know now as Mexico and Central America, conscription and involvement in military service allowed many of these individuals to legally pass, basically present petitions to their new governments to be recognized as mestizos, or to be recognized as full citizens. So that was another thing that accelerated this process of dissolving Blackness, so to speak, into what would be these new nations. Now, Hispanophone countries, because we will, for the sake of this conversation, not address Brazil and not address places like Belize, which border Guatemala, but in Hispanophone countries, we see a kind of national narrative that works in very similar ways. And that is, it's actually quite simple. Indigenous equals backward, mestizo equals citizen. In places with a deliberate call for European migration, such as Argentina, Chile, or even Costa Rica, where part of that new national building plan included receiving as many millions of European immigrants as possible to whiten or blanquear the context, we still see indigenous equals backward, white equals citizen, right? In all of these cases, in all of these Hispanophone countries, what stands out then is the absence of Blackness, the idea that it has been dissolved into a national people, a national body. For instance, Vasconcelos is one of the primary supporters of this idea of new Mexican citizens as the cosmic race, right? This new emerging people that combined elements from European descendants and African descendants and indigenous descendants into one formidable group. We also see this translating into a legal erasure. So censuses that don't count Afro-descendant people or that discount Afro-descendant people. In the last census in El Salvador, where my family is located, there was a count of 7 Black individuals. And the notes, the actual footnotes in that official document says, well, these are probably not real Salvadorans, they're probably foreigners. Now, knowing my history and knowing my mother's line, I know that they're not foreigners. But it is this assumption that Blackness is foreignness. Blackness is the Haitian population that has migrated into the Latin American countries and is now seeking entry. Or Blackness is something that's Cuban, or Blackness is something that's Brazilian. Anything but what is in that national Hispanophone context in the mainland. The big denial there is slavery, the denial of enslavement. And it's something that isn't included in the curriculum at any level and hasn't been discussed until Las Vidas Negras Importan, or Black Lives Matter, has become part of our conversation today in the 21st century. Now, it has also meant and resulted in geographic marginalization of Black peoples. There are Black communities, such as the Garifuna communities, which are an Afro-Indigenous group of peoples that live in the Caribbean coast of Guatemala, of Honduras, of Nicaragua, in places that have been isolated and marginalized from the larger national context for centuries. These individuals have not been allowed, so to speak, to be part of this national body. There is a pigmentocracy in place, and you're perhaps familiar with the term meritocracy, where it's assumed that you can climb the social ladder based on your merit. Well, pigmentocracy is the idea that climbing the social ladder and having a place in institutions and structures and being recognized as a citizen and having that ability to supersede your beginning origins, your marginalized conditions, really depends on your color gradient, the amount of pigment in your skin. That's what we discuss as pigmentocracies, and it's something that is in place in Hispanophone countries, those in the mainland, but also something that we see in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in many other contexts. I'll end there and I'll open it up to Q&A. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you so much to Dr. Licon and Dr. Gomez Mijevar. That was really wonderful. I just learned some new things too. I'm like writing down notes, especially I think what the womb laws, like that is, wow, I was taken aback by that. So that's something that I'll be looking into on my own as well. So thank you so much for that history. I think it's really important to just get us all on the same page here and share some historical perspectives. So I do have just one question that I want to set us off, and then I'll pass it on to Irma to see how we're gonna do the Q&A part, just because I'm not sure how we want to handle that. But just as we're thinking about, then we're looking at the questions that folks have been asking in the chat. Maybe if folks want to start asking their questions in the chat, then we can kind of shuffle through your questions in a minute when we start the Q&A. That would be really wonderful. I think just to save time, we're gonna say who's asking the question and read your question. We're gonna waste a lot of time if we just let everyone talk. So unfortunately, that's the way we're gonna do it. So please now ask your questions on the chat, and we will try to figure out how to make sure that your question gets answered. In the meantime, I want to ask los doctores here today with us about just thinking and everything you just shared, right? Has a historical context, how we want to say we've progressed, right? We've moved forward, you know, whether it's in Latin America or here in North America, and thinking about civil rights movements across the board, and in free, getting freed, and things like that. But yet we still see the symptoms of anti-Blackness. We still see some of these things that you all spoke about, right? Like leaders not wanting to meet with folks that were of Afro descent, or people being prosecuted because of the color of their skin. So my question to both of you is, how do you still see symptoms of anti-Blackness within our communities, within some of the pieces that you already kind of mentioned, but just more of those day-to-day, how do you all see that manifesting itself within our communities?
I think on the day-to-day, my first thought is at the very micro level, which is the family level, and looking at family photographs. And this is something that Dr. Henry Louis Gates does with individuals that he speaks with in the film Black in Latin America, where he focuses on Peru and Mexico. And the subtitle of that is The Black Grandmother in the Closet, right? But one of the things that really spoke to me personally is listening to family members say, oh, ella es más feíta, o nació feíta, just a little ugly. And that is always used as code for darker skinned, noticeably Afro-descendant. And, I don't really buy the it's con cariño story, because, obviously there's a lot more going on there. But, in individuals that will speak about their mothers or their sisters or their children that way. And so that colorism really translates to the day-to-day and really affects, really, I think, is the incipient pigmentocracy that these children, right? Many times it's children that begin to hear this and then grow into this kind of shaming of color. And I think that that's become extraordinarily impactful in terms of where individuals see their career trajectories going. Oh, I'm too feíta to be a nurse. No one's going to want to receive treatment from me, or demasiado feíta to be a doctor, or those kinds of things, where I think the message is filtered in extremely early and at a very local, personal level.
Right. Thank you so much. I definitely think I know exactly what you're talking about. And then how do we internalize that? Because to me, that's internalized racism. When I start to believe that I am lesser than because of the messages I received growing up, that is internalized racism. And then how do we then enact that oppression on ourselves by limiting ourselves, limiting our opportunities, and living in this kind of oppressive state of mind? So absolutely. Thank you so much. How about you, Dr. Licon?
It's such a big topic. It's such a broad topic. It's so difficult to address and to know what to focus on. From, kind of briefly, like looking at Latin America, where I think much of Latin America tends to be more class-based and they don't see the racism. Whereas in the United States, we tend to devote more attention to race and then don't see the class issues. To racism in the United States and how most people don't understand it. And I think a big part of that is the confusion between someone saying or doing something racist versus racism not needing anyone to say or do anything explicitly racist to someone else in order for racism to be perpetuated, meaning for disproportionate injustice to be perpetuated generation after generation. And that continues without anyone having to call anyone else something bad, either in their face or behind their back. To the colorism and internalized colonialism within us that we see in everyday interactions and everyday decisions. How do you decide which is a good school and which is not a good school? How do you decide where you live? What is a good neighborhood? What is a bad neighborhood? It's all all of this is systemic, and it's ingrained into all of those different levels. In my family, I know I heard my mom talk about herself as, she talks about when she first left her little town in Mexico and came to the United States, and she says, I didn't know anything. Yo era bien India. And then they make similar comments of, like, oh my God, I've been working so hard, trabajo como negro para vivir como blanco, or something like that. And so, yeah, it's embedded in our culture, and it's this legacy that we haven't been able to get rid of. And I think in part because we don't see it. It's just embedded in our culture and we don't see it. But I think that's what we're working on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Licon and Dr. Gomez Mijevad. That's really important, and both points definitely resonate. And we continue to see this and ourselves, in many ways perpetuating it because we don't know, or because we don't understand, or again, that internalized racism and seeing whiteness as superior can really be detrimental to ourselves and our communities. So thank you for naming some of that. I think it's important. Given time, I want to move on to questions that folks have, because I did see some questions in the chat. I don't know, Irma, have you been keeping track?
I have, yeah. Hey, everybody.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Faustina. Muchas gracias. So we have a number of questions here. So I'll start with questions from Joanne. Cis, gracias por tu pregunta. The question is, I have a personal struggle teaching the word moreno because books say they're brunette or dark-skinned. I grew up with moreno used for Black people, but I don't even know if that was used as a euphemism due to racism. So curious to hear the thoughts from the panelists on that.
Yeah, moreno is a really interesting word. I also grew up with it used as a euphemism. I grew up in South Central, as I mentioned earlier, and it was used as a euphemism for Black US folks. But then learning about the history of it, moreno was actually a term that many of the future leaders of Central American independence and Mexican independence used as a term for themselves that was distinct from the casta system. So it wasn't, the casta system had many other terms like mulatto, for instance, or some other terms, but moreno was not one of those. So it was one of those born from the context kind of terms. That said, it was a step to mestizaje and a step to being called mestizos officially, and categorized as such when individuals were born and they were registered by the church in the parish where they were born. So it was something that was self-denoted in the late 18th century, early 19th, and taking up willingly, but with that idea that it was kind of a stepping stone to a full citizenship. It is a tricky thing. I think Dr. Licon might have a lot to add about that as well.
Yeah, so yeah, the two places to me that stand out for the use of the term moreno are Mexico and the Dominican Republic. And I don't know a ton about the Dominican Republic's use, but I highly recommend that there is that documentary. There's a documentary series called Black in Latin America that's included in the resources, and you mentioned the one about the Black grandma in the closet, which focuses on Mexico and
Peru.
I forget. Peru, yes. But there's others that address the Dominican Republic. And so yeah, there's the moreno as a euphemism, but also as a way of even erasing the people who are Black historically in Latin America. In the United States, I also grew up in Los Angeles, in the city of Inglewood, and I was living there during the LA riots in the 90s. I'm not a fan of people who think anytime someone speaks Spanish, it means they're talking about them. But with that said, back then I remember lots of Spanish speakers, when they wanted to talk about Black people in a way that they would understand, because they would understand the word negro, they would say morenos as a way of being able to talk about them, which is in a way, again, connected to what we're talking about of the racism that we live with and that we may not be aware of. So yeah, there's that part of it too. And I don't know if we addressed your question. I don't know if it was country specific.
I just want to chime in. I will say, just based in my experience, and I obviously can't speak for all Dominicans, of course, but I would say in my experience growing up, moreno did not equate blackness in the Dominican Republic. If anything, you wanted to be morenita. You did not want to be negra, right? Negra meant black, and it meant something you did not want to be, right? Based on how we treat our Black Latinos, it was something that was frowned upon. Even my dad being a Black man, dating my mom who was a lighter Dominican, even that coming together was really frowned upon in my family. And my dad had to offer things, right? I'm gonna take her to the United States. I'm gonna give her a better life. He had to say, I have these resources, right? He couldn't be a Black poor man, right? He needed to have some sort of wealth or something to offer my mother because of the color of his skin. And I would say definitely growing up, it was, you did not want to be negra. You wanted to be, if anything, if you were a little darker, you had some melanin, you wanted to be morenita in our culture, and specifically thinking about the US, right? Because in Dominican Republic, that might look a little differently, but I will say that that was not something that equated Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a number of questions here in the chat, so interest of time, I'll jump into a few more. We have a question from Adriana. Gracias, Adriana. So what are the strategies that we can use to get Latinx communities who have never experienced racism to open up about the conversation and bring it out of the idea of quote unquote class as a real problem? So how do we have those conversations?
I'll jump into that. Hi, Adriana. I know Adriana. I will say one way that I have been able to talk to my relatives who are lighter skin or white passing Latinos is really to get them to understand that there are Black Latinos, right? This conversation right here. We have skin in the game. That is part of the problem, right? That for a long time, we did not want to speak on the fact that we are also, a large part of our community is Black. If we understand our ancestry, if we understand the transatlantic slave trade of where a lot of slaves went, if we don't understand these pieces, it's hard for you to comprehend why you should care about Black Lives Matter, why you shouldn't have these anti-Black messages, why you shouldn't judge a baby when they're born and say these horrible things. You know what I'm saying? Make these assumptions already on a baby that was just born based on their skin color. So for me personally, Adriana, what I do is remind people that we have skin in the game. We have Black Latinos that are also prosecuted, right? When a police officer pulls over a Black man, they're not asking you if you speak Spanish or not, right? That's not even they don't care. Frankly, they don't care. So it's something that we need to start being more vocal about and really normalizing that this is our community too, and that we are part of this, and this is all of our struggle. None of us are free. No one's free until all of us are free. Fannie Lou Hamer, social Black activist, leader, organizer, just all of bad, bad mama jamma. But definitely thinking about that, I just wanted to name that it really starts with that education piece.
Thank you, Faustina. Any other comments, or should we jump into a next question here?
Next, yeah, I completely agree with Faustina. Yeah, not much to add.
We have a question here regarding the interest from the panelists. So what brought your interest into researching this topic, or why are you interested in this topic as a lived experience to talk about with our communities? Why is it important? And thank you, Monica, for your question.
Well, it affects our everyday life, ¿verdad?
Yep.
Well, for me, it was the connections that I started to make. There was one book that I read that was called Seeing Indians, which is focused in El Salvador, and it was an ethnography of indigeneity in El Salvador, and led me to then look at census data and how that kind of codified official notes. That then, it was very strange, because then I did a pivot from, oh, we don't talk about how we're Mayan, but oh, we don't talk about why my mom has curly hair. I've only heard about how hard it is for her to brush, and I grew up like wanting her hair, but to her, she used the term pelo malo, which is very common, you know, bad hair. And then, you know, then thinking about conversations I'd overheard about, like my niece, for instance, who their little girls wouldn't play with her because she was negrita, you know, and then looking at family photographs kind of through this new prism that wasn't the official, you know, this is the way you see it, Salvadoran, just Salvadoran, national identity, no ethnic identity, but rather, oh, wow, you know, these are the things that that narrative was hiding from me, but which were always there. I mean, I grew up watching my mom comb her hair. It had to be wet, and like she could do these like rulos and things she could do with her hair that I could not do. And I was so jealous, and I wanted her hair, but it was frustrating to her. But you know, those kinds of things where it started to feel really personal. And then, as I mentioned early on, I wanted to know the who, what, when, where, why, how. The conversation was just kind of literally cut at independence, because in my grad program, I was reading a lot about, you know, these firsthand accounts of enslavement and emancipation, and of crónicas, you know, that took us back to a world that was rigidly divided into castes. And which was something that prior to my own graduate training, I'd only associated with like India, you know, but knowing that Latin America was originally stratified like that, and that at some point we stopped talking about it and stopped seeing it like that, was interesting to me. That said, as I continued in my work, I became a bit concerned about using, you know, a US lens for a Latin American context. And then kind of realizing that here we also omit class, and which is a big reason why we have a hard time talking about structural racism in this country, and driving that point home, because we refuse to see how color and privilege constitute kind of the foundation for structural racism. In the same way, you know, we don't talk about structural racism in Latin America because we are colorblind as a result of these liberal policies, which did lead to, you know, those countries becoming independent, but also to dissolving, negating, and just eliminating color and race and enslavement as part of that conversation. So just felt like my eyes opens up. It was a Pandora's box, so to speak, of lots of possible questions to look into.
Yeah, for me, it was growing up in Inglewood, California, part of LA. You know, being a teenager in high school during the LA riots. Inglewood at the time was about, I don't know, about 45% Latino, 45% Black. And we had a lot of racial tensions. And one of the things I learned, however, is that we weren't being taught our history. We were taught a little bit of African-American history and almost nothing of Latino history, despite being a school in a place that was 45% Latino. One of the things I started learning by learning my own history is how much African Americans and Latinos had in common in their history, both when you look at Latin America and within the United States. And so then, you know, that's where my passion for learning history started. And so then, you know, now I'm a historian.
Muchas gracias. we have a whole lot of questions, and unfortunately we are at time, so I let Faustina close, but do know that we're going to have another session. This is a series. We had a session in Spanish as well, first series that is on YouTube. Please follow us there as well, and if you want any information, reach out. Faustina?
Yes, thank you so much. And just to let folks know that these resources will be sent out to the LatinoLEAD newsletter coming up. And so these resources, and I'm going to share some stuff as well on other resources and other videos and things that you all can continue, to educate yourselves. I want to leave you all with something, and then I'll ask if our rest of our panelists want to leave you all with something. I know there's a lot of questions. We will also be sharing our contact info. I'm speaking for the panelists. I'm sure we'll be happy to answer questions that were not able to be answered today. This was an hour, is never enough. I mean, there's never enough to talk about this, but we'll be able to share our contact info if you all want to connect to just one-on-one personally. But one thing I will leave us with is remembering that when we are talking about Afro-Latinidad, we are talking about Blackness. We're talking about owning that. We're talking about our history, and those things cannot be separated, right? Because there are Black Latinos, and the more we continue to normalize it, that we don't erase that history, we don't erase those experiences, and that, like I said earlier, the struggles happening right now in this country around Black Lives Matter are important, because they're also our struggles. They're also our community. Those are folks that, we can easily say, oh, wow, that could happen to someone I know, a relative of mine. That could happen to my dad, right, as a Black man. So I think it's really important for us to start really having conversations. As we named today, a lot of history wasn't taught, which is why we did like that historical perspective. A lot of this has been lost in our schooling. And it is our job, right? A lot of us that are in these spaces have the privilege to be educated and to have gone to a higher learning institution. And now it's our job to pay that information forward, to share that knowledge, share that wisdom, so that we can be better equipped to be better allies, not only to folks within other communities, but also within our own communities. There's a lot of work to do within our own communities around anti-Blackness. So really getting started there is really important and crucial. And I'll see if our panelists want to add anything.
Yeah, piggybacking on what Faustina just said, I really want to encourage everyone who's listened in on this conversation to really look at this as a hemispheric issue. As Faustina said, this is a prime moment. It's an important moment, and it's really piggybacking back and forth with other movements that have grown organically in Latin America. I'd encourage everyone to check out Las Vidas Negras Importan, a movement that has really given rise throughout Latin America. It's strongest in Brazil. You'll find resources about that. I encourage you to look into OFRANE, which is the Organización Fraternal Negra de Honduras, which is one of the foremost Black liberation organizations in Central America today, organizing around the issue of homelands, of Black homelands, and integrating that into a conversation about place and belonging in the Isthmus. Also encourage you to look into the movements happening throughout the region to change the census in those countries, to start including those designations so that people can be identified, and that they can, and so that structure of oppression begins to be dismantled across the region. And I also encourage you, lastly, to look into the context of slavery in Texas, and then the rest of the Southwest and the West Coast, and what happened when those states were absorbed into what is now the United States. So thank you, everyone, and recommending one last resource, Juliet Hooker's Theorizing Race, in which she discusses Frederick Douglass, for instance, Augusto Faustino Sarmiento in Argentina, Du Bois, and many others in this idea of a hemispheric discussion of Blackness.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. We had in the upwards of 60-ish folks at one point, so this is amazing. There's a commitment here, and continue that commitment beyond this 1 hour conversation, right? Now take what you've learned and hopefully today and have these conversations. I know I'm gonna be Googling these womb vows and having more conversations about that. This is how we continue our education and our knowledge. So I wanna hand it off to Irma to send us off.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this conversation. We know that there are so much that we can share with you all. We will definitely do our best to get at every single question and resources that you all provided in the comments, in addition to the resources that our wonderful panelists had for us today. And I just want to thank the panelists one more time for putting this together on short notice and ensuring that we were able to share history, which I know was part of what all of you mentioned from the first conversation that we had about this topic about 2 weeks ago. So thank you so much for doing that, in addition to providing tools on how we can combat this for ourselves and within our own community and family members. And these series will continue. We will definitely be moving to different topics. So please do share in the comments any feedback that you have, any other topics that you might want to hear. We will make sure that we will provide that, and know that we truly have your feedback and really look at the comments that you share on how to move this conversation forward, to make sure that we are not missing on what you want to know and learn more about. So this was a reflection of that from the first conversation, and know that there were still so much to know, but I think really begins on learning that ourselves, and really begins on us doing our own research too. So we hope that we provided that initial light for that. And again, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for representing our communities and having an honest conversation about what this means for all of us. And we will see you all very soon. And thank you so much again for being part of this conversation with us. Muchas gracias.